a professor at a university. One of our missions, believe it or not, is training and helping develop the workforce that you folks might hire. What is needed? What is the advice to young people who are excited about drug development and want to get involved? Any or all?
Programming. I need people who know how to write code and deal with large data sets.
Do they need to know biology?
No.
They don't need to know biology, but they need to know how to work with other people. So to me, teamwork and collaboration are a key skill set that we look for. You can be the best programmer in the world, but if you're not going to listen to the people who do know biology or know other sciences that are critical, you're not going to work well with us. No one can do this alone. No one discipline can be successful in this.
Other?
I think you've got to be interested in the mission that we all have in drug discovery and pharmaceuticals in healthcare. Because if not, if you have programming and you're able to work with other people, why wouldn't you go work for the tech industry? I mean, they're probably going to pay better than we are, honestly. But I think there's such a sense of purpose at all of our companies in terms of the value we can bring to patients' lives that, if you believe in that, then this is really the right place.
Yeah, I would say we need everyone. We need software engineers to build the infrastructure. We need data scientists that are incredibly deep mathematically trained. And we also need data scientists that understand biology that can bridge the gap between biology and data scientists. And there are lots of different roles across the tech stack for folks with all sorts of experience.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the point about people who are interested, because I always prefer people or want people who are curious about what they're doing. And we work a lot with high school programs, encouraging that type of research. And one of the things I like to tell them, because there's this big push out there to say, it's like, go smart people, go work on, the problems because they're important, you can make a difference in the world. And that's true. And, with all these superhero movies, we hear that a lot. It's like all the best superheroes are scientists and, you'll go get your superpowers. But the thing I'd want to put out there to people who are thinking about this is that you could go take these skills, this interest in these problems and all of your talents and go work where you can make a lot of money or have the success. But working in the confines of we have to do excellent science and excellent work, and we have to do it to sort of better human health or better things, it's a harder problem. If you really want to work on the hardest problems, add that added constraint of also helping people while you do it.
Great.
I will say and this builds on what Ron was saying, the absolute hardest person to find is the generalist that can talk to everybody and make sure that everybody, when they use certain words, mean the same thing. And it's really, you need someone who's senior enough, who's maybe worked in a couple of different disciplines, but that can bring everyone together and can ask the right questions and see when you use that word, you don't mean the same thing when this person uses this, because our disciplines have grown up in silos. And so that translator, that generalist role is probably the one that we have the hardest time hiring for.
Super helpful. I hope all the students and postdocs are listening. I'm going to scan the mics, and I'm hoping and expecting that those of you who with questions will add them in. But my second question, and it actually jumps off this first question, is you all had a remarkable comments about how your institutions are really committed to this data-driven in different ways, but it's all data-driven. It was all very clear. It's why you're invited. How hard is it to change the culture, especially for the big companies? So we have a J&J, we have a Novartis here, we have other big companies. There are people who've been at those companies for 20 and 30 years when they were not data-driven companies. And so there's, I'm sure, cultural challenges like the salty old chemist who says, I've brought 4 drugs to market and I didn't look at a damn piece of data. Or what, I don't know what it is that they say. But I'm sure there's resistance. Can you describe some of the challenges of this new culture?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that gets to Mimi's point about communication, right? People don't speak the same language, and they don't even know what questions to ask sometimes, and certainly not who they can go to. And we definitely have some of those people.
Yeah, and I guess I'll share a personal experience at Novartis. I didn't realize all of how deep this was and entrenched and where all we needed to focus. If I could go back and do anything differently in the first 20 months, it would be to understand the broad impact that this could have on people. And so one specific example I was sharing back in the backstage, that we brought on 5 terabytes of data and the single node into our cloud platform, and the single node that we were using, it caused multiple jobs to be delayed because that was how our data platform was set up. It never occurred to me to ask that question, like, can you handle this data load that's about to happen? What will happen to the other? I wasn't working with a big data company. And again, I come out of hospital systems and out of kind of this world of population health. I was used to large data sets, but it didn't occur to me that maybe those in pharma weren't. The other impact that had when I took this data for the teams that were working with real-world data, they were all doing their programming in SAS. So that's fine when you have small data sets, but if I give you 20 terabytes of data and you try to run SAS on that, it will take a week and then it will fail. It didn't occur to me that I needed to say, oh, we need to look at some other tools. We need to look at R. We need to look at Alteryx. We need to look at Python. And that I would be setting up, we call it our data university, where we're training people on how to use these tools. So if I would say anything, it's ask those questions, and really you should ask questions that you may not think are relevant as far down the chain as possible. But it was really a learning for me, and if I could go back and do anything differently, it would be to come in with a broader understanding of how not only were the people we have to change the mindsets, but there were going to be skills that we needed to update. And these were great people who were there for all the right reasons and were extremely valuable to the company, so we needed to embrace them and help them feel like they were part of this movement.
Yeah, and I think it takes both a top-down, which you obviously have, and the same is true at our company, but also you have to have that buy-in from all the different levels. So we have many data scientists. They may be called by other names, epidemiologists, statisticians, bioinformaticians, whatever, spread across the company. They're not always the best connected. Not all of them know people in the other groups. So it takes some coordination to make sure that that community is really as vital as it can be, and also that at all the different levels, people really buy into this vision of a data-driven organization, and they're working towards it, right? So they all know from the top that's where we're moving towards, but they need to be able to see how they can contribute to it.
So, my dad sent me a meme last week for the first time, and I was like, I didn't know he knew how to do that. And, he's an incredibly smart guy, but he just didn't seem to care, but then he needed to care, so he did. And I think there's a tendency, especially for enterprise IT, or when you're trying to do these universities, when you're trying to educate, there's a tendency to assume we need to sort of target people down the middle. We need to say, okay, how can we go ahead and make sure that the salty old scientist, with his corncob pipe or whatever, knows how to access these data. And I think the capacity for people, any age, any background, to adopt new technology is way more than we give them credit for, and that we should take the mentality that put the expectation that someone can learn a SQL query. Put a harder interface. It doesn't have to be as point and clicky as you might think. You don't need to dumb the big data down for people, because we could see, someone comes out with a new app, the new Snapchat or whatever, and everyone adopts it really quickly. We should leverage that and, have high expectations for people and let them rise to the challenge, because no one's really in this field if they're not willing to, take those challenges on.
Yeah, so we even have the same challenges in a small startup, because we're hiring people that are across many different disciplines. And I would say, this reminds me of the point I think Mimi made about people have to be open. So at the end of the day, you have experts in many different domains, and whether you're a data scientist or a chemist or a biologist, we all have to sort of appreciate that we don't have all the knowledge across the entire organization, and we just need to be able to bring everyone together to synthesize those ideas, and folks just have to sort of be open to that and open to the idea that, I don't know everything, and that, this process is going to be sort of a melting pot of lots of great ideas in whatever we're doing.
Great. So I see we have one in the back, and then the front, and then the back again. So please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for being here. Great panel. I have a traditional background in lots of sourcing life science, mostly molecule sourcing. So I'm very intrigued, Emma, about what you're doing. Mimi, also, you might have something to say about this. In traditional sourcing, you have a very clear value proposition. You kind of know what your targets are, and you kind of know what success is going to look like, and that helps drive what you agree to partner with. So my question for you is, what is J&J thinking about around, I don't know, KPIs, or, what's good will look like in terms of, and how does that drive your decision making?
Yeah, I think the data sciences space is absolutely a difficult one in terms of thinking about partnering. I actually gave a talk on exactly this point last week. But it's for a combination of things, right? As you pointed out, in sort of traditional molecule sourcing, whether we're working with a smaller startup or biotech or whoever, at the end of the day, we're all trying to develop a new drug, right? You can agree on the targets. The alignment is clearer, even if there are cultural differences between a smaller company and a big company that you have to get past. In considering data science startup versus a biotech startup versus a big pharma company, you're adding that extra layer. And particularly if it's people coming from the tech industry, there's different expectations, different value propositions, different business models. People are moving on different timelines. And so all of that does make it challenging. And there's quite often these gaps that happen where, there's a company that's developed a new algorithm for computational drug discovery. And where they can get to with that is they have a list of candidates which they think are better than what you could get to otherwise. They've gotten to it faster, more cheaply probably, and they have a higher chance of probability of going all the way through the drug pipeline. But the bottleneck is still the biology, right? It costs a lot to validate those things. And you end up with a situation where there's not enough evidence to build that faith necessarily on the side of the pharma company. It takes a lot to get to the level of evidence where people are like, yeah, definitely, I believe, and I want to partner, and I want to move this forward. And you end up with this gap where a lot of things fall in the middle, or you have a company which started off as just a purely AI company, which pivots to become, AI-enabled biotech because it's an easier gap to bridge at that point. And I think you lose something there, right? You lose the opportunity for the farm to do something early and to really improve their pipeline. You lose the opportunity for the biotech. Maybe it's a better opportunity, but it's also it's got more reward potentially, but it's higher risk as well. And that's something where we have to take it on a case-by-case basis, honestly. There's not a simple rule to get past it, but it is something that we see a lot.
Thank you. I'm going to go to get as many questions as we can.
Barbara, Vietnam Vaccine Safe Initiative. I had a quick question to most of you, actually. We talked a lot about potential drug targets and maybe the genetic background of a patient. What I'm more worried about in terms of precision health is what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with all of our effort, and how precise are we at measuring those? And is there crosstalk between companies to have an agreement on what we want to achieve in a certain disease area, and with regulators and clinicians and all of those other people involved? Because I think we've been trusting a lot in the things that we call real-world data, and the epidemiologists are always nodding. When we go into terminologies and details, we realize that we're not always as precise as we'd like to be.
So I love this question. It's just great, and we are spending a lot of time thinking about this. So I work primarily in the world of oncology right now, but I'm an internist, and previously I worked more in diabetes, heart failure, and more chronic conditions. I will say that, death is the outcome that we can actually measure, but not always as easily as you might think. But when you want to look at something that's more proximal and maybe more meaningful, and in oncology, one that we often use is progression-free survival, which means that I need to measure whether or not something is progressing or not. There's actually no ontology framework, anything that has been proposed. There's actually one that has been proposed by Deb Schrag out of DFCI, and but how you would collect that is still talking about manually abstracting from a chart to understand where, and her framework is called PRISM. So it's pathology, radiology at the local site, imaging at a distal site, signs, symptoms, and biomarker. And so when you look at that, you need to know, well, were all of those assessed at a time? Were they not assessed? Was it present or not present in terms of progression? it could be put into an existing ontology in the EHR, something like SNOMED, but it hasn't been validated. And what those mean, we would have to define for every type of cancer. And the hematological malignancies will be very different from the solid tumor. So a lot of research and focus, and this is why I'm glad you asked. I don't think that everyone who picks up these data sets are aware of those issues. And when they see progression in a data set, even if it's been coded, they may not know that progression by a biomarker is different than progression by imaging. And we don't know if that has a meaningful difference or not. So I will say, though, that I sit on an advisory board for the NCI around big data, and our working group of the advisory board, I think, is how, because the government has to have lots of names for things. So we're a working group of the advisory board to the NCI working on big data, and this is one issue that has come up several times. And I'm so glad that the NCI is interested in exploring this, because until we have regulators and I would say the academic medical centers and other communities come together to try to address this problem, it's going to be very difficult to move forward.
Thank you.
In the back, please.
Hi, so I'm a student at Stanford, and one thing I found during my research at Stanford is that public data sets like Binding DB, Campbell are just like very noisy. It doesn't really give me good results when I'm trying to build a machine learning models. And when we try to collaborate with, say, like Merck, we find their in-house data give like very good results. So I was wondering how big pharmas are considering to facilitate the sharing of their high-quality data to advance like data science in this field.
So I should chime in because most of my job, like I said, is with our collaborators getting data out to them. And we do the whole exome sequencing for the UK Biobank, and a big part of that commitment is to get that data open source and out there. So in March of this year, I can't take credit for this because I had just shown up, but we did the first release of 50,000 exomes, and there's a continued schedule to get those releases out. So that's just one specific example, and I'll tell you that the one thing about my job that keeps me up late at night, which also speaks towards the previous question, is the idea that there's something wrong with the data, that there's some noise or heterogeneity that's out there that I don't know about. We know these data aren't perfect, and we quantify that as much as we can. But getting those data out there in a way that we understand what those things are, and working with our collaborators to understand and harmonize those data. So there's two things I'll say, I think specifically your point. One, on my last slide, I put some public resources up there. Those resources are huge quality control resources in addition to all the other services they provide. So standardizing across companies and efforts to not necessarily we're sharing results or we're saying you work on this and I'll work on that, but at least understanding the set of standards that we're using together, that's a continual process. And we have to engage in these public consortia like GA4GH, Genome in a Bottle, to make sure that we're all doing things in a similar way, and that also jibes with what's going on in academia and pure research. The second thing I will say is give us your feedback. If you're using a data set and you're finding it noisy or messy, quantify it in some way that you can and tell us. I mean, I'm not going to speak for everyone. Tell me, I have a help desk email folder and I need to know about that because we need to get that data as clean as possible, because if it's not as clean as possible now, as the technology evolves and we want to iterate, sort of make things forward compatible, it's just going to be messier. So please communicate any issues you see with any data sets that you use, and I promise, at least for us, we will try to fix them.
We have a twofold approach, internal and external, very similar to what Will was describing. So our internal, we have something called the Novartis biome. It's actually located here out in Palo Alto. And the idea is that it creates a sandbox for people to come in and interact with our data. We just opened a second location in France. So that's one way that we're doing it. And then we're looking at how we can work with and influence. We don't think we should have to create everything our own, and that's one of the critical elements. So we're working with like AACR, Genie, IHI, Harmony, and others to create the right data models that will have impact for us, as well as promote better care for patients. So those have not only the genomics component, but some of the clinical EHR record data, as well as patient-reported outcomes, and then something I'm very interested in personally, more the home life record and how the patient is living at home and what their daily life is like to understand. The EHR is just a tiny sliver of what's happening in the patient's life. I really want a much bigger picture of how we're impacting patients and the people who care for them.
Thank you. We have here, and then I think in the back, and then over the side. Please.
So with all the recent development in data science and machine learning, the drug development cost from research and development to marketing should go significantly down. So how come the recently FDA-approved Novartis drug for spinal muscular atrophy is priced to be $1 million to $4 million?
So it hasn't actually been priced yet, and I will say that Voss, actually our CEO, just wrote an article, and we'll talk about this much better than I can. It is a very interesting thing to start thinking about a cure. So a drug that's administered one time and will have a lifelong impact. The pricing for that is a challenge and something we've talked a lot about internally and have used data and analytics to help support. I have to say I haven't worked on it personally, so I can't talk about any specifics, but I did see just before when I came on stage an alert that Voss had a new article out on LinkedIn that I'd be happy to send to you. That's a better source of information that I can provide. But I will say that this is something that we talk about a lot as an industry. As we're moving more towards curative therapy that are administered at one time, the payment models that we have are not necessarily aligned to the current way that we're approaching the therapeutic advances. And so we have to start thinking about how to bring those together. But that's probably a little bit outside the topic of big data and precision health.
You may all be aware of this, but the National Academy of Medicine last year issued a report on drug pricing. Very interesting report. There was a report, and then there was a minority objection from a couple of members of the panel who disagreed with the overall findings. So if you want a little bit of fun reading, I recommend that report.
I was more alluding to the research and development cost for this, not more on the pricing. So that was my question. That
I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood.
Yeah, so all these new developments that are happening at this time, I believe some of these new technologies must have been used to develop that particular gene therapy drug. So, so that also relates to cost. So I'm more towards the research and development side, that how these new technologies have helped to reduce or will reduce the cost of some of these novel drugs that are coming to market.
Well, I think that's what Emma said earlier. We're still proving that out. That hasn't been proven yet. And I think that there is ample opportunity for it to be so in the future, but we haven't actually proven that it reduced cost. And I didn't, in my slides, I was going to talk a little bit about the pipeline and how we want to shorten it, but as you all know, I decided to change my talk impromptu. So our hope is that it will shorten the pipeline as we're able to use the advances, and that will result in a reduced cost. And it will help us stop doing work on other things that are not advancing more rapidly. And so it's just as much about advancing a successful product and therapy through as it is about stopping work on therapeutics that aren't going to go there and going back and reevaluating. But I think Emma said it well earlier. This is, we're still proving that out.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go back.
Emma, you had that great example where healthcare providers and patients had almost opposite ideas of where digital could have impact, better EMRs versus better diagnoses. And this kind of a thing could, of course, happen within individual companies as well, where digital could impact so many different things, and you have to choose, especially if it ranges from, say, logistics to manufacturing to R&D and so forth. And maybe to the panelists, how do you choose where to invest in digital efforts in your companies?
I think it's a great point, and I think Mimi kind of addressed it when she said data and analytics can impact every part of what we're trying to do in the pharmaceutical industry, from the early stage when we think about the genetics to identify new targets, new biomarkers, all the way through to manufacturing and actually, marketing, everything actually related to it. And there are areas where I think the technologies, the algorithms tend to be more advanced, right? They've been more proven. Imaging is an obvious example. And so it makes sense to start there. So I think that was part of my message in terms of starting small, thinking big. eventually we do want to apply it to the entire chain, the entire pipeline. But we should start with the ones where it's easy to prove that value. And we need to test out the other technologies. We need to see where they might be able to add value and keep on top of that. But we're not going to do it everywhere because then everything will just be too fragmented. So it takes time. It's going to be a process.
So I think we've addressed that recently, but it was again on pricing. But what it sounds like that's great is you are having a bigger influence on the financial models, because I think most companies are still in the antique debit and credit age, as opposed to utilizing advanced data techniques, which will enable them to do a better pricing. Because I'm worried the political winds, if this isn't addressed, is going to start to bleed off your research, which is the most important. So it sounds like you are having at least some degree of influence on that area with the expertise you're building into your companies?
Yes, and Voss has spoke about this in the past. Every product that we release, when we do pricing, we have an internal process that we go through of creating a value-based price. And that value-based price, when you start to think about the impact, and this is where initially we started with traditional health economic models, but it became quickly apparent that we were going to have to rethink that. And so I mentioned the one-time curative therapies. The other thing that's really exciting in oncology care is we do targeted therapy in the beginning where we're precisely defining what happens. But as we start to be able to do liquid biopsies and monitoring patients a lot more closely, we will be able to change their therapy. So the sequence and combinations that they might have could be very unique. If you and I have the same cancers, even if we start with, say, the same mutations and the same marker pattern, we could evolve very differently. And I was presenting and I said, imagine going to payers and saying, I don't want to just talk about a drug that's going, drug A that's going to have impact X in Y amount of time. I want to talk about how this therapeutic journey is going to be highly personalized for this patient and how we're contributing to that. And that's not something that really any of us are prepared to do in terms of our current financing model. And so there's so many different ways that we can use data in the future to really understand the value in getting at both the true value, but also understanding how we could develop therapies that are better for patients.
Just a follow-up. Have payers shown any interest in these more comprehensive models?
They have, and I think this is one place where we've spent some time talking to ICER, which is, if you're not familiar, they're a group that looks at pricing in the healthcare industry. And one of the things that we spent some time talking to them about is it's not just the impact for patients, but also for the people who care for them. So if a therapy happens to require someone to take off from work so they can take their loved one to get their treatments in, and they're having to do that, and there's a lot of they won't be able to cook or care for themselves, they have to stay with them for 24 or 48 hours after therapy, that type of impact is a lot different than someone who may go in once a week or once every other week for an infusion and then are able to go back to work. But we don't have good ways to talk about that type of impact, even though we know it has significant economic impact. And for me personally, as a woman, I would say most of that impact is happening to women. And that's been something that we've just assumed as part of their roles as natural caregivers. But we really need to understand and think about this and then talk about it in a different way. Yeah. So thanks for letting me expand a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking at the screen where it says predict, prevent, cure. And I think as we move towards doing all these things, we do have to think about new ways of doing it, right? So prevention is another area which people are hugely interested, but it's not one where the economics are completely worked out, right? So you have to start the discussions, but obviously data and analytics are going to come into it hugely.
In the back?
Hi, I'm Vlasta from WebShield. We develop new technology to virtually share sensitive regulated data while maintaining privacy, security, and compliance. My question is about business models. Could you share your thoughts on the new business models that may be enabled by the data science development in your industry?
I mean, there are...
Big question.
It is a big question. Is there any particular area that you're asking about specifically, or just...
the merging of AI and drug discovery it seems like it does necessitate a different approach to how you monetize drug discovery type of initiatives within your companies, and how you collaborate with startups, for example, and companies outside of your organizations to develop and jointly develop new IP?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's not a simple answer to that. That's part of why in my talk I said, look, we do customized partnerships. Every situation is different. But I think you're seeing, you know, there's a lot of business models in terms of software as a service, platform as a service, data as a service, everything. And what you're seeing are things like drug candidate as a service as well, where people are working quite closely together. And, you know, we have conversations with people in this space a lot. And you might ask them, well, what's your business model? How would you like to work with someone from J&J? And the answer that usually comes back is, well, we're flexible. We'll figure it out. We need to figure out where there's value that can be brought on both sides and how we can move forward together. And so I don't think I think people are open to a lot of different things, but it's not like there's one clear winner in this space.
I can, though, add maybe what not to do. Just a couple of key points. So the thing that will almost shut me down completely is when, and I've been in more pitches like this than I care to say, but they're like, I have all this great background in technology, never worked in healthcare, but I'm confident that because of my background in technology, I can solve all of your problems. And that just overwhelming sense of confidence, outweighing any sort of competence, is really just not going to get very far very quickly. The other thing is I have this amazing knowledge map, or whatever the keyword of the day is, or blockchain technology that will help you understand and do things in a totally new and different way. And they share something with us that we've already either mastered or isn't really that critical. So what that is really not understanding what the problems are. So I think companies that do their homework, that understand how it fits in, that really invest not in either having advisory boards or whatever, of building a cohort of people that can help them be successful in this space, are much more likely to, and that are open and flexible and transparent about where things are. That's the other big no-no, is I will see through a wireframe pretty quickly, no matter how sophisticated it is. It doesn't take a lot of questions to really see through that. And so be transparent about where you are. Don't think you can solve all the world's problems, and make sure you do your homework before you show up, to at least not use me as free consulting to help you figure out your business model. And it's amazing how many times that happens.
Yeah. I marked it. It was 6:09.
I got that off my chest.
No. It was 6:09 on the monitor when someone said blockchain. I was waiting for that all day.
Had to put it out there.
I mean, someone needs to say it. We're at a big data conference. Especially in the genomics and genetics space, I'm terrible at business, but I do know that what scares me in genomics and genetics, especially as we push these data towards more precision health and it's accessing all of the money that's out there in healthcare, is the number of snake oil salesmen who are going to be out there. I really think about the lack of education, not just for everybody in terms of genomics and genetics, but for experts. There's so much we don't know. People ask me all the time, hey, I got my 23andMe, what can you tell me? I'm like, I don't know, you have $100 less? Like, give it to me. There's not much more I can interpret, because there's so much out there that we're still working on. So be wary of business models that are somehow seem way ahead of where the genomics and genetic science is. And sort of the key to that is recognizing exactly where we're at with those data right now, which is that we largely limit our analysis to 1% of the genome, maybe 2% on like a good day, right? So this idea that there's a lot of value to be drawn from these newer, later technologies. It's very nascent right now. And I think that just be cautious, and caution your friends to be cautious, especially if maybe you've heard me talk and they haven't. Like Will said, be careful about spending your money on genetic stuff.
So, I'll just add and maybe be a little bit futurist about this. So the industry is sort of built around this idea that it takes a really long time to get a drug from basic biology to lots of chemistry to working in humans, and that's sort of the business model of the entire industry right now, because that's the reality. It just takes a long time. And so what we're looking for oftentimes are making sure that, in those very few cases where we are successful, that, there are large enough patient populations and we can actually, be able to create that drug product that we can sell. But it's sort of interesting to think about, well, what if all this stuff works, over the next 10 years? What if we can actually start with very simple chemistry and then turn that simple chemistry into a real drug product in a very short amount of time, in 1 year? And what if we could do that, and scale it across, 10x or 100x? How does that sort of shift the way that we think about treating disease? I don't have the answer because we're not there yet, but it's just interesting to think about what that future looks like. Do you actually get into more subscription models where, maybe a company has, hundreds of different types of therapeutics that may or may not work for, different genetic backgrounds of patients?
That's exactly what I was getting at. Just what is that future going to look like? Because things are changing. I mean, Ford is becoming a data company, not a car company. So I feel like there may be some parallels in your industry, and that's exactly what I was looking for. Yes, thank you.
The most exciting thing, I think, along these lines, and when as companies shift, I like when people come to me with, you talked about when someone comes and they said, here's my pitch, and you can sort of see through the nonsense. Always send your scientist. If you're making a pitch,
Yes.
Send your nerdiest, least social, whatever it is. Don't worry about how they come off. Send the nerdiest person, because I'm going to ask the hard questions. But what I really like are to see people who have sort of identified solutions in one field and sort of found an isomorphic one in another, and they're saying, hey, I'm an expert over here, and I've solved this, and I've done enough work over here to see how this method applies, and I'm going to bring it over there. There's an existing expertise, and they've done the actual math or the work to figure out how to work that through. If you can give me a nerdy person who can explain why that's the case, that's going to go a lot better than the fireworks or the dog and pony show.
And they don't have to have all the answers when
No.
they come. I think it's better to say, this is what I do know, and this is what I think is possible. Let's
Yep.
talk about how you see this coming together.
Yep.
It's extremely good news, going back to my very first question, that nerds are wanted, because we have plenty of those.
I hate to
We're
speak
good.
for everybody up
Yeah.
here, but I would think we all qualify as nerds
Yeah.
too.
No,
Well,
I'm super cool.
I think that's a wonderful place to end the panel and to thank our panelists.